So in our Phil 2310 Theory of Ethics class, we proceed with Donagan's Theory of Morality, Chapter 2. The title is Presuppositions and Principles. And so we want to know what are the underlying presuppositions in his philosophy, and then we want to develop the principles that will be key to his philosophy. Principles then are what structures and is the foundation for the moral philosophy that he puts forward. And he'll develop it here in this chapter quite clearly. But first of all, we have to start out with presuppositions, and we have to consider what's presupposed with regard to the nature of human beings. And Donagan will rely on the Hebrew Christian tradition again in considering this. And he nicely brings out the understanding that is the foundation for the approach that he takes. Again, he's not proving anything here. He's just explaining exactly what he presupposes about the nature of human beings as he follows the Hebrew Christian tradition. So he decides first to compare the Hindu and Judeo-Christian traditions on the nature of a human person. In the Hindu tradition, the human person is the soul, and the suffering that takes place in the body is for the sake of the purification of the soul. In the Judeo-Christian traditions, the whole person is considered to be the moral agent, what suffers, body and soul together. And this is nicely brought out by Donagan when he raises the issue of the meaning of the parable of the Good Samaritan. You'll recall that the Samaritan was walking along the road and he found a Jewish man in the gutter, beaten up and in very bad shape, and he tended to the injuries of the man and helped him and expressed concern for his body as well as his soul. In the Hindu tradition, properly speaking, one should allow for the purification of the soul to go on with the sufferings that take place in the body, and then the human being is reincarnated. But that's not the case in the Judeo-Christian traditions at all. So rather, the parable of the Good Samaritan is that the whole person is taken care of. When the human being is injured, it's not just the person's soul that we care about, but it's the body and the soul together. And so the Good Samaritan arranges for the person who was beaten up and thrown in the gutter to be taken care of, physically taken care of. So that's really quite clear what he's doing then, what Donagan is doing, and he's explaining how he approaches it. So the human person is not the body and is not the soul separately, but rather is body and soul together. So as he states it then, after he lays this out, two fundamental presuppositions of the Hebrew Christian tradition are the following. First, human beings, or man, considered as a moral agent, is a rational animal. This means then, in this context, that human beings will have to be recognized as animals and as rational. Now this is quite significant because as animals, we have wants, needs, desires, and as rational, we also have interests in knowledge and knowing and guiding ourselves toward satisfying the wants, needs, and desires that are appropriate. So the notion of animal in here, though, is quite significant because it means that it is right to satisfy our animal needs, but in accord with what is considered appropriate for a rational animal. So that's a presupposition. This is not the same as in the Hindu tradition, not the same as what's found in many other traditions. So here it is that human beings considered as moral agents are rational animals. The second presupposition is this: the world human beings inhabit is a system of nature in which events occur according to morally neutral laws. What he means by morally neutral laws is that nature itself does not punish human beings for anything. Rather, if a piece of ice falls off a tall building in Chicago and somebody down below is killed, that's the way nature is. When the sunlight hits that chunk of ice on the top of the building and it begins to melt, then it slips and slides off, and in accordance with the system of nature, gravity pulls that ice down toward the ground, and if a human being is there and struck by it, the human being may be severely injured or even killed. So it isn't that nature is a system of morality, rather it's a neutral system. And so the idea here is then that HIV, for example, is not God's punishment of homosexuals, which would of course be very bad, would be a bad aim on the part of God. Rather, HIV is a virus. That's all. It's a virus. And it has its own nature, and it spreads among those who are susceptible of it. And so too, then, with regard to a cold that we may get just before an exam or something, this isn't an issue of God punishing someone or nature punishing us. Rather, these are naturally occurring things that just happen in an ordinary way in the world. These are the fundamental principles, that are presuppositions, that he assumes then, that human beings are rational animals, and nature is a separate system where things happen according to morally neutral laws. So the superstitions that we have are just that. They're superstitions. They're not about reality. So that notion, that saying, step on a crack, break your mother's back, or something of that sort, that doesn't happen. You're not going to break your mother's back if you step on a crack. And so too with regard to the notion of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. This is a sad affliction that occurs occasionally with infants, and they stop breathing and they're found dead in the crib. Now, the first notion that occurs to the parents of an infant who's a victim of SIDS is that they did something wrong. But it isn't that they did something wrong. It's something in the nature of the child where the brain did not give the signal to the lungs to breathe, or did not give appropriate signals to the heart. And this sort of thing happens. It's fairly rare, but it happens, and it's recognized. And so it isn't that the parents did something bad, but nevertheless, we, in our psychological needs, find it really difficult to deal with things that are not in our control at all. And so we get this notion that we should punish ourselves somehow. We did something wrong, that we made this sort of thing happen. Well, this is a long-standing reaction to the uncertainties of the natural world on the part of human beings. And so human beings then will punish themselves to try to control the gods and make sense of things. Mexican Indians, Native American Mexican Indians, would sacrifice people, human beings, to the gods. And so that's a way to control or pacify the gods in some fashion. Well, so too then, if we blame ourselves for some action when something bad occurs, then at least it seems to make some sense. It's sort of easier in some respects, and we often fall into this idea of trying to control the gods ourselves by our own disciplining of ourselves somehow. Or we blame ourselves when something bad happens, when in fact it's a naturally occurring thing. And maybe it's very sad. When one's parent has a heart attack, well, people have heart attacks for reasons, and there are reasons and causes, and they are natural to human beings. And we use medicine to counteract that. But if your parent has a heart attack, it's not your fault in some fashion. No. These are natural things, and that's what he's got in mind here. The world has its own natural rhythms, and we are part of it as the animals that we are. And occasionally things happen that we don't understand why, we can't explain it. The real explanation may just be a faulty valve in the heart or elsewhere. And that sort of thing happens among human beings. And we fail with regard to our muscles, our veins, our organs, that sort of thing happens. Of course, if one abuses oneself, that's a different story. But these are naturally occurring things. And it isn't that God is punishing us in some fashion, but rather they're naturally occurring things in the world. So these are his two presuppositions with regard to the philosophy that he's putting together. First, human beings are rational animals, and both aspects of a human being must be respected. And secondly, nature is a separate system that has its own rules, and we are part of nature, and we are subject to those rules as well. But nature is not morality. Nature is not used to teach moral lessons to people. It's an independent system of its own. Now, He makes another distinction here that's very important for our discussion, and that is first the distinction of first order and second order moral questions. Now, these first order moral questions have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Okay, so we figure out whether some action has taken place, and was it something right or wrong. Let's consider that something wrong has occurred. Perhaps someone harmed a child in some way. Something wrong occurred. All right, the second question that follows upon the first is this: is the person responsible for this? So if a child is hit by a car, then something wrong has been done. There's something bad happening. But it's a separate and distinct question to ask whether the person driving the car was at fault. Certainly the person driving the car that hit the child, then that person did kill the child. But was that person responsible for it? It may well be that the child ran out into the street and ended up throwing himself in front of the car, chasing after a ball or something. So these are two distinct questions. First, whether the action is right or wrong, and then if found to be wrong, the second order question is, was the person who perpetrated the wrong, in fact, doing something wrong? Was the person responsible for the action? So Donagan puts it this way, that actions of certain kinds are unconditionally contrary to reason, of course, implies that reason is practical as well as theoretical. Let me explain that. So we take the notion that some actions are contrary to reason. Well, this is an indication that we believe that reason functions in a practical way to help us figure out what the right thing to do is. We know reason functions with regard to theoretical matters in science and mathematics and many other things too. But our assumption here is that reason is a practical tool for figuring out what the right thing to do is. That's a presupposition that he has. Now he adds this: how reason can be practical is a topic that will be investigated in the final chapter. Okay, so hold on for that we're going to investigate that later. But how reason can be practical in the sense of being a good guide to right action. So that's going to be in the final chapter on the foundation of common morality. So we have to save that for later. He says, for the present, it is enough that common morality presupposes that it is. Close quote. So the common notions that we have of morality presuppose that reason is a valuable tool. So he's being very philosophical and setting out the basic assumptions in everything that he's doing, the basic issues that we need to be aware of. So one of the assumptions here is, yet to be shown, that common morality presupposes that reason is valuable and plays a good role in practical action. Put another way, actions that we do cannot be or should not be contrary to what our reason tells us is the right thing to do. This is nothing more than recognizing that reason plays a role. I know that's a very simple philosophical matter, but let's put it all on the table, as it were. Now, these next two statements that I have here on the slides are definitional. So he's just giving us definitions. Remember, we're still in the section on presuppositions and principles, and he's laying out definitions. So he says, I shall call a precept, so he's talking about the use of the word precept, I shall call precept any universal proposition of common morality. Okay, so any universal proposition that relates to common morality. So it's wrong to murder human beings, something like that, with regard to the permissibility of any kind of human action considered objectively. So that's a precept, and the precept will give us a statement, a universal statement, that all human beings should act in a fair way, something like that. So we take a universal statement, and it'll help define what is permissible for human beings. So that's called a precept. He also then adds, I shall also follow earlier moralists in referring to some of the more general and frequently cited precepts as principles. So he can use the terms precept and principle for many of the same things. That's all he's saying. So in case you're wondering what he means by a precept, he means a universal proposition or statement of common morality that concerns what's permissible for human beings, considered in an objective way. And he can also use the term principles for that. Now, he sets out some further information here. He does it in a philosophical way, but I'll translate it for you. He says, every precept of common morality can be expressed in one or another of the following three forms. So he has the precepts of common morality with regard to what's permissible or impermissible, and now he's going to lay it out in three forms. First, it is always morally permissible to do an action of the kind K as such. So, to put it another way, to translate it, some actions are always permissible. That's one group of actions. A second group of actions, number 2, it is never morally permissible to do an action of the kind K. So some moral precepts then say there are things that it's never morally permissible to do, such as to murder a human being. It's never morally permissible to murder a human being. I didn't say kill. Killing can be done in self-defense, but it's never permissible to murder a human being. It is, with regard to number 1, it is always morally permissible to do an action of the kind K, where K is an action for the good of a human being. Okay, so those are permissible, to do things that are good for human beings. Number 3, it is never morally permissible not to do an action of the kind K if an occasion occurs on which one can be done. Some things then, some moral precepts are such that you are obliged to do them. You ought to do them. So he's used two negatives here. It is never morally permissible not to do. So these are actions which we must always do if the occasion arises. Right? So there are some things that we ought to do. We owe things to other human beings. We owe them respect, perhaps. And so when we have the opportunity to show respect for another human being, then it's not permissible to do otherwise in that sense. So we have then what is permissible, what is impermissible, and what is obligatory. The third is an obligation, what we owe to others. But he expresses it here with the variable K because of the kind of action it may be. So that's just explaining the precepts of common morality and how they relate in three forms. Again, those three forms are what's permissible, what's impermissible, you may not do it, and what is obligatory, you ought to do it. So, number 1, it's okay to do. It's always okay to do it. Number 2, it's never okay to do it. And number 3, it's something you ought to do if the occasion arises. Now he goes on. Precepts about the culpability or inculpability of agents. Let me pause there. Culpability means responsibility. So precepts about the culpability or inculpability, responsibility or lack of responsibility of agents in doing what they do would make no sense whatever unless their actions were in themselves objectively considered permissible or impermissible. All right, so we can't talk about responsibility or culpability unless some actions in themselves, considered in an objective way, are permissible or impermissible. Hence, he says, I shall refer to questions about permissibility or impermissibility of actions as first-order moral questions. So first-order moral questions concern the permissibility or impermissibility of an action considered in an objective way. And so that's one thing about considering the actions in that way. But questions about the culpability or inculpability of the agents in acting as second-order moral questions. So the first is the action, with regard to the action someone might do, is it right or wrong? And then secondly, is someone responsible for it? So these are first-order and second-order moral questions, and they are distinct. They are distinct questions because first, when the police arrive on scene of an accident, let's say where a child is killed, then they find the child has been killed and something impermissible, the killing of a child, has taken place. The second question is someone responsible for that? If someone is responsible, that person is culpable. But it may be that the person is not responsible because the child fell off a truck or something of that sort, and the person could not stop in time. But that all has to be investigated. So it isn't immediately obvious. We investigate these things as we investigate all accidents. Now, he's now going to develop the fundamental principle, and this is key to his entire philosophy. He's going to develop the foundations for all of what he's doing in this philosophy. And he's going to do it out of reflection on the Hebrew Christian tradition. So he writes, most Jewish and Christian moralists have held that the part having to do with rational creatures in their relations with themselves and with one another also derives from a single first principle. So most of the thinkers think there's basically one rule. And so he's going to try to develop one rule that will be the foundation of everything. So everything will be tested against that one rule. And that rule is the fundamental principle on page 66 of your books. Now, Kant developed a fundamental principle, and that fundamental principle was the categorical imperative. In the course, and we've seen that already, right? You must always act with respect toward other human beings, and yourself, right? So this is Kant's categorical imperative. It guides us toward the right action, because we always check to be sure that we are not failing to show respect to someone. That's the purpose of the categorical imperative, to keep us on track with regard to respect for rational beings. Now, in this context, one might say a fundamental principle is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But that's not good enough, because two people could decide to show disrespect for one another and proceed to do so. Because they want the pleasures of it or something of that sort. They could decide to use each other sexually. Not to care about one another, but just to use each other as a means to pleasure, period. That's all. But that would not be showing appropriate respect to oneself or another, because we are, as Kant said, absolute ends. We are absolutely valuable human beings, and we should never be used as a tool by someone else, a tool for the attainment of pleasure. Rather, we have to be respected, and we have to respect others as well. So the golden rule is not quite good enough. So what he does now is he goes into Hebrew Scripture and looks carefully at it. And he says, Leviticus 19, verse 18 says, love your neighbor as yourself. And he goes on to say, although Jesus went on to interpret neighbor as standing for any human being whatever, that was the interpretation of Jesus. In the passage from Leviticus, the term strictly refers only to one's countrymen, so that a Jew's neighbors in a Jewish state would be his fellow Jews. So the text itself indicates that you have to love your Jewish neighbor as you would love yourself. Not others, not all human beings, not in a universal way. He goes on, though, Donagan goes on, however, rabbinical teaching as codified in Moses Maimonides' Mishnah Torah joined the passage in Leviticus to another in Deuteronomy, the two together being equivalent to the principle in Leviticus as Jesus interpreted it. So Moses Maimonides, a rabbi and a great philosophical and theological thinker, actually put this together in the interpretation just in accord with what Jesus did. And Moses Maimonides lived in the 12th century. All right, so this is exactly what Donagan said he was going to do. He was going to draw on the Hebrew Christian tradition in order to establish a fundamental principle here for his morality. So let's go on. So this is what Maimonides came up with. To love all human beings who are of the covenant, as it is said, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Okay, all human beings of the covenant are the Jews. But Maimonides combined another with that, and he found this in Deuteronomy. To love the stranger, as it is said, ye shall love the stranger. So Maimonides put together the two texts from Leviticus and Deuteronomy and came up with the same sort of thing that Jesus did. Not just love your Jewish neighbor, but love all human beings. And of course, love here means respect. So you shall show respect to the stranger, and you shall so show respect to your own people. In other words, show respect to everyone, or to love your neighbor as yourself. So what he's doing is developing this notion out of the Hebrew Christian tradition, as I said. Now, Thomas Aquinas also contributes to this discussion in very important ways. For Aquinas, there's a primary and common principle with regard to morality. And the common and primary principle is love your neighbors as yourself. So we're just looking at how Aquinas developed this as well. Aquinas came after Maimonides. Aquinas is a 13th century thinker. Number 2, the first precept for the derivation of natural law is this: good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be shunned. So do good and avoid evil. That's the first precept with regard to the deriving natural law and seeing how natural law fits in for human beings. And for Aquinas, natural law is derivable by human reason from our own situation in the world as creatures of God, who created human beings the way they are in accordance with his own wishes. 3, he goes on and says, the primary and common principle of natural law may also be formulated as the following: act so that the fundamental human goods, that are key to us, our fulfillment as human beings, whether in your own person or in that of another, are promoted as may be possible, and under no circumstances violated. So the basic human goods, communication and food and growth and education, etc., these are basic or fundamental human goods, and these must be promoted as much as possible, and under no circumstances may they be violated. So Donagan goes on to say it is a principle of what Kant thought of as respect, actum, but of respect for certain fundamental goods. So Kant had respect for all persons, but there are certain fundamental goods that are essential to human life, and that's what Aquinas has in mind. So it's a principle of natural law that you must not withhold the common goods from a human being. You must not violate that, but you must promote the things that are good for human beings as much as possible. That is to do good and avoid evil in our interactions with other human beings. And so interpreted, it plainly follows immediately from the first principle of practical reason. So it follows from that first principle as well. The fundamental principle then for Donagan, as he works through these thinkers, he comes up with a fundamental principle, and this is on page 66. If you find it similar to what's in Kant, there's no surprise there. But here it is. It is impermissible not to respect every human being, oneself or any other, as a rational creature. That's key. That's it. Everything is tested against this for Donagan. Everything. So our social interaction, our obligations to others, our human sexuality, everything is tested against this rock, so to speak, this fundamental principle of Donagan. It is impermissible not to respect every human being, oneself or any other, as a rational creature. And this will also have implications for the family in very interesting ways that we'll get into later on. So, the structure. What is the structure of a first order system? Well, here's a couple of comments on the structure. No action which falls under the concept of not respecting some human being as a rational creature can fall under the concept of being permissible. So now he's setting up the structures. So as it were, you have a box, and the box has things which are permissible in it. The concept of what is permissible for people to do. In that box, you will not find anything, any action which falls under the heading of not respecting someone as a rational creature. Okay, so with the permissible stuff, what is permissible then will not have anything that fails to respect a person as a rational being. Page 66. He goes on in 68 to say, to accept traditional morality is to accept its fundamental principle as true. So if you're accepting traditional morality, it is to accept the fundamental principle of respect it being impermissible not to respect every human being, oneself, or any other as a rational creature. To accept traditional morality is to accept that as its fundamental principle, and you accept that as true, and hence to be confident that the concepts in terms of which it's formulated are not liable to break down when we have new cases. So when one accepts traditional morality, one acts as if it's going to hold up whatever the future holds with regard to new and unforeseen cases. So that's what it means to accept traditional morality. Now, in the third part of the theory of morality, he deals with first-order precepts. And I'll get into that a little bit later. I'll get into that in the next video. For now, this is enough for the present video, this video on Chapter 2. The next video on Chapter 3, I'll try to get that done tomorrow, and I'll pass it on to you.